Good morning. I want to thank Maya for that beautiful family story. That was probably a hard thing to share, and I just want to thank her for that. That was wonderful to hear. So, this whole month we have been practicing what we teach, exploring different spiritual practices that help us live our best lives. Today, as you know, I get to talk about forgiveness, which I think we all know can be complicated and challenging. It's really just a principle to put into practice in our lives. It's biblical, which I'll talk more about in a moment. But in preparing for this talk, I kept asking myself, why is forgiveness so complicated? And one thing that kept occurring to me is the people and things and situations that need forgiving happen on a very wide spectrum. There are things that cause us minimal pain and inconvenience, and they might be easy to forgive. And then there are things that cause us such deep pain and sometimes can cause lifelong suffering, so much that they may seem impossible to forgive. So for instance, just to throw out a couple examples, let's say you have a lunch date planned with your best friend, and she forgets about it, and she doesn't show up. And you're sitting in the restaurant waiting, and you have to text her and remind her, and you both laugh about it, and she rushes to come meet you. Probably not that big of a deal to forgive your best friend, right? There's a big difference between forgiving something like that and forgiving a stranger who has murdered your child. That got dark real quickly. I can't even fathom that kind of pain and having to do the spiritual work to forgive something like that. Yet it's the same principle to apply to these hurts, whether they are small and inconsequential or enormous and life-altering. There is simplicity to the spiritual principle of forgiveness, but that doesn't make it simple or easy to do. The simplicity is the belief that we are all good and we are all one with each other, one with God, the good. When I think of some of the big, horrible, tragic things that people have had to forgive, like mass shootings, physical and mental abuse, things like the Holocaust, where do you even begin? Anne Frank wrote in her diary, "In spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart." I think she was 13 when she wrote that, and we all know she wrote it while being forced to live in hiding to avoid capture and death, which her family was unable to do successfully. She had the belief that all people are good. There's a woman named, and forgive me, her name is a mouthful, Immaculée Ilibagiza, who wrote a book called Left to Tell. And it's about how she survived the Rwandan genocide in 1994 by hiding in a bathroom with 7 other women for 3 months. She lost her entire family, her parents, her brothers, her extended family, all of them were slaughtered. She was a Christian, and she wrote about her belief that the people who perpetrated these acts and participated in that genocide were children of God, just like her. She forgave them. It's hard to think about an adult who does something horrible as being a child of God, as being a child. It's usually easy to forgive a child. When my youngest daughter, Enid, was about 2 or 3 years old, she was obsessed with the Sesame Street character Zoe. Zoe is Elmo's best friend. She's orange. And so Enid had a good-sized Zoe doll that she slept with and carried everywhere. And it was soft and plush, except it had big, hard, white plastic eyes. So one night I was putting Enid to bed, and I used to wear glasses back then, and somehow I remember I was putting her to bed and bending down. She was in the bottom bunk of a bunk bed, And I was leaning down, and she was swinging Zoe, and those hard plastic eyes smacked me in the face full force, right between the eyes. My glasses broke. I screamed and cried. I mean, it hurt so much. I felt like I had just been punched right in the face. I was crying, and because I was crying and hurting, Enid started crying. I scared her with my reaction. So I immediately had to stop reacting to my pain and tell her it was okay. It was an accident. And I remember telling her, I forgive you, honey. You didn't mean to hurt me. It was easy and effortless to forgive her, even in the midst of my pain that was real, because she was an innocent child. One time, a few years after that, I was out walking my dog. I had a little Jack Russell Terrier named Love, and her name will be ironic in a second here, because when Love was on a leash, on a walk, she would be very protective of me if a loose dog came up, and she would be aggressive and bark and snap. So one day I'm walking her, and a big dog comes running up to us, and she's trying to fight it. So I scooped her up into my arms, and I don't know who I thought I was protecting exactly, but in the midst of this scuffle with this dog, Love bit my arm, broke the skin. I was bleeding. I was so mad at that dog. So I get home, and I'm telling my kids the story of what happened, and my middle daughter, who was probably about 10, says to me, calmly and rationally, Mom, sometimes I get mad and act crazy, and I hurt you, and I break stuff, and you always forgive me. You have to forgive the dog. Wow. She was reminding me that our dog's innocence was just like her own, like all children who are all good and innocent. It is challenging to remember that all people at their core are divinely created, innocent, and good. Now, they may lose their innocence through trauma and their own painful life experiences. I'm sure you've heard that saying before, hurt people hurt people. It's true. When you're struggling to forgive someone, it can be very helpful to imagine the hurt child behind the action that hurt you. I want to say that again because I think it's so powerful. It's helpful to imagine the hurt child behind the action that hurt you. Often we're dealing with a hurt child. When we've got some person, some experience, we just can't bring ourselves to forgive. Where does that leave us? What is the opposite of living in forgiveness? When we don't forgive or we can't forgive, it means we're holding on and carrying past hurts with us. We're thinking about them. We're feeling anger and pain and resentment, which we know only hurts us. There's another insightful saying that says holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. It doesn't work that way. We are poisoned by our anger. Now, as I mentioned before, forgiveness is biblical principle. It's scripture. Jesus is asked, how many times are we to forgive? And he tells them 70 times 7. Which according to all the scripture commentary I read, really just means a limitless number of times. We are to forgive our brothers and sisters forever. Now, what I found interesting is the meaning behind the original language. Aphiemi is the Greek word for forgiveness that appears in the Bible, and it means to give up, let go, or keep no longer. That is the spiritual principle of forgiveness. It is the way God forgives, and we are to forgive in the same way. Ernest Holmes wrote about this in The Science of Mind. He said, remembering that the Spirit holds no evil toward man, and that God is love, we should emulate this divine lesson and forgive all, that our hearts may be free from the burden of our own condemnation. God doesn't know anything about sin. And of course, by sin, we mean the belief in duality, believing in our separateness from God, believing we are separate from our own divine nature. Spirit forgives this because it doesn't even recognize it. It's given up, let go, never held against us. Now, when we forgive, we stop carrying the incident, whatever it is. We stop thinking about it and let it go. That is really when the magic begins to happen with this spiritual practice. It's not about letting a person off the hook. It's not about liking them or really having any kind of relationship with them necessarily. It's about releasing the situation and seeing what is revealed in its place. When we don't forgive, we're blocking our own consciousness and we're blocking our good. The divine science minister Emmett Fox wrote a book called The Sermon on the Mount. And in it, he discussed the importance of forgiveness with regard to the demonstration of our good. He said, if your prayers are not being answered, search your consciousness and see if there is not someone whom you have yet to forgive. Find out if there is not some old thing about which you are very resentful. He suggests that if we're holding a grudge, we will see our demonstration of good after we perform an act of forgiveness. By allowing forgiving thoughts about those who have wronged us, we end up bringing about the very blessings of the divine we wish to attract in our lives. What's left when you release the pain and suffering and forgive? It's the truth of spirit, which is good and only good. This good, our good, is revealed when we practice forgiveness. My favorite illustration of this is Wayne Dyer's experience with forgiveness. I think you probably all know who he is. He was a renowned motivational speaker and prolific New Thought author. He spoke openly about his father, who abandoned him, and his two older brothers, and his mother, when he was only 1.5 years old. This was in the 1940s. He and his brothers ended up in orphanages and foster homes while his mother tried desperately to work and earn enough money to be able to care for her sons and get them back together, which she did eventually. Wayne details the anger and rage he felt toward his father. For years, he said almost every night he would dream about fighting him and confronting him. And as he grew older, he became obsessed with finding this man who caused his family so much pain and suffering. Then one day in his 30s, Wayne learned from a cousin that he didn't even know he had that his father had died 10 years earlier. Even after learning this, he was filled with rage for him. He wanted to go to his grave. He had very limited information. All he knew was the city he was buried in, Biloxi, Mississippi, and he knew the year that his father died. It's just an amazing story of spirit at work. Wayne ended up renting a car, and he had planned to drive to Biloxi, and in the rental car that had never been rented to anyone else before, it had less than a mile on the odometer, he had to get in, and he was looking for the seat belt, and he had to get underneath the floorboard under the car, underneath the seats. And underneath there, he found a business card that said Candlelight Inn, Biloxi, Mississippi. And he thought that was so odd. He couldn't even figure out how could that have gotten in this car. So he sets it aside. He gets to Biloxi. He doesn't know what cemetery he's buried in. So he has to get on the phone and start making calls and doing some research. And he ends up discovering that his father is buried on the grounds of the Candlelight Inn in Biloxi, Mississippi. It's an amazing story. So something bigger was at play here, clearly. He finally gets to the grave, and he admitted he considered peeing on it, but he didn't. Instead, in that moment, he let out his rage. He cried, he yelled, he talked to his father for several hours at that gravesite. And then suddenly, he felt a wave of calmness and peace wash over him. He finally knew the time had come to abandon the hurt and anger that he had carried for all those years. He said out loud to his father's grave, "I forgive you." From that moment on, he sent the man who abandoned him all those years earlier only love. Forgiving his father was the most important spiritual practice Wayne Dyer could have done. It propelled him into his purpose, and as Emmett Fox told us, his act of forgiveness helped demonstrate his good. Wayne's life was completely changed. He released the situation, and almost immediately, his good was revealed in its place. He went back home after that time at the grave, and he had 2 weeks before his university professor job started back up. And in those 2 weeks, he had taken all his notes from years of his work in a psychology practice, and he wrote his first book, Your Erroneous Zones. The book became a bestseller. It sold millions of copies. It started his life on a trajectory of enormous success and well-being. His health improved. He dropped bad habits he had had. He found love, got married, had children. His life experience was good after he released and let go of years of resentment and anger. His story is so powerful. Forgiveness is an opportunity to turn away from pain, releasing it and letting it go, and ultimately turn toward God. If you think of it this way, when we are holding tightly to grudges and past hurts and regret, our hands are closed, our fists are tight, and we don't have that open hand that is ready to receive our good. By not practicing forgiveness, as I said, we're blocking our good. So the call to action today is for each of us to consider what needs forgiving in our lives. No one can answer that but you. Only you know who or what you might need to forgive. But I really encourage you to think about it and use this spiritual practice because you deserve all the good that is available to you. Because as Dr. Bob would say, you're wonderful, and so am I, and so it is. Thank you.